Hi, I'm Ken Howard, and welcome to the Gay Therapy LA podcast. Today, I am very honored to have my very special guest, David Ley, Ph.D., who has been one of my mentors and one of the people I have admired most in the mental health field, who shepherded me all through the process to become an ASECT, the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, certified sex therapist. And he's been just a great figure in the field and author. He is the author of The Myth of Sex Addiction, a book I've relied on a lot, Ethical Porn for Dicks, and Dave, I'm going to mess this up. Insatiable Wives, what's the tagline? And the Men Who Love Them?
Women Who Stray and the Men Who Love Them.
Women Who Stray and the Men Who Love Them. Yes. So all of these books. And, I think I've mentioned in previous episodes how I've relied and been inspired by books. And occasionally I recommend books to my clients for understanding topics in more depth that we can't, get to necessarily always in a therapy or coaching session. And so these books are a way of enhancing the work that you're doing with your therapist or coach. But let's see. So, Dr. Ley, for people who don't know you, tell us who you are and your work and some about yourself.
Sure. So I'm David Ley. I'm a psychologist. I'm based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I've been in practice 20 years or so now, and been started working with sex offenders, and then expanded into working with a broader array of sexual issues, and particularly developed a passion for addressing the degree to which the mental health field pathologizes sexuality out of ignorance as opposed to when sexual behaviors are really unhealthy. One of the things that I often point to is that the original DSM, issued in, I think, 1953, identified masturbation itself as a psychiatric disorder. Code 317.1 was the diagnosis that everybody got if they admitted to their doctor that they masturbated. And that, unfortunately, that level of sexual ignorance and shame and morality is just really imbued within the mental health field because we don't talk about sexual diversity very much. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from the DSM, which was a very important step, but it happened because of social pressure. It happened because gay men publicly and within the APA came out and said, look, we're gay and there's nothing wrong with us. This is not a psychiatric disorder. But here, 40 years later, 50 years later, right, we are still unfortunately dealing with the fact that the mental health field tends to pathologize sexuality that is something that we think is slightly outside the norm. And most of that is because most therapists, many people don't know this, most therapists, 90% of therapists have no training in sexuality.
Wow.
Their only training in sexuality is their own sexual experience. And so what that means is that if you're seeing a therapist who has never had gay sex, or if you're seeing a therapist who has a lot of shame or concerns about their own sexual desires or the desires of their partner, they're very likely to view your sexuality as challenging. Kinsey said it best: the definition of a nymphomaniac or a sex addict in today's language is anybody who has more sex than the therapist. So if your patients are getting laid more than the therapist, there must be something wrong with them. It is that kind of bias that I find extremely disturbing. I've seen, unfortunately, many patients who have been shamed and stigmatized by their therapists around sexuality. And that was something that, about 10 years ago, I decided I really wanted to work on and to address, to pull the morality out of mental health and sex therapy practices. As you mentioned, I'm certified by the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, ASECT. And one of the things I get to do is help excellent clinicians like yourself become certified as sex therapists, and I view it as a really important step that I'm making, helping us to have more therapists like Ken Howard out there
Mm-hmm.
who are engaging in ethical, informed therapy with people, so that our patients don't have to be afraid to talk about sex in therapy.
Yeah, I get that a lot about people who feel like they want to talk about sex, but they can't. They don't feel comfortable speaking to a female therapist,
Yeah.
or even a gay men's a gay male therapist who's either not a specialist in gay men, or we've seen even locally in Los Angeles and certainly nationally there are a number of gay male identified therapists who really push the sex addiction model. They say they're iffy about it, or they're getting away from it, and yet they write books that have the word
Right.
sex all over it, and some very high profile. And of course, your book is the myth of sex addiction. So,
Yeah.
how did you come about with the idea? If somebody says, you know, I'm a sex addict because I read about it, or because my therapist told me I was, why do you call foul on that? What is the myth?
Um, well, when I wrote the book, I wrote it largely based on the research and the literature that existed then. That was 2012. And I said, look, the arguments that people are making that sex is addictive, they just don't really hold up. They don't stand up to scrutiny. These are heavily morally based arguments. The interesting thing is that in the 10 years since I wrote that book, there has been a tremendous amount of research on sex addiction. And what's fascinating is that it almost all has gone in the direction of my arguments. And so we now know that the number one predictor of a sex addict identity is not how much sex a person has, but their moral or religious conflict with sexuality. So if they grew up in a highly moral or religious kind of environment, they are more likely to now view their sexuality as being unhealthy or out of control. Gay and bi men, research finds now, are at 3 times the risk of being labeled sex addicts. And that is interesting because the concept of sex addiction was born in the 1980s during the HIV and AIDS crisis, when
Yes.
everybody was afraid of male sexuality and afraid of gay sexuality. And we had Oprah out there talking about the down low phenomenon, which turned out not to be true, but spreading a lot of fear of gay and bi men. And those men, um, many of them terrified of their sexuality, went to sex addiction therapy as a way to try to contain their sexual behaviors. And in the process, they ended up shaming themselves pretty aggressively. Joe Court, who's a therapist in Detroit, sex therapist, he has talked about this, and he identified as a sex addict for a long time and was a sex addiction therapist. And then he left the sex addiction industry because he said he realized that it was about shaming him for his non heterosexual desires, and that he was then shaming his patients. Rob Weiss, who's out in LA, he's a really prominent sex addiction therapist, and a out gay men. He has acknowledged that the sex addiction industry did wrong by gay men by treating homosexuality as an addiction. The first book on sex addiction, Out of the Shadows by Patrick Carnes, the first edition of it actually identified homosexuality as a sex addiction. And the field, unfortunately, has a long, long history of treating same-sex desires as a disease. And it was interesting in 2015 when the United States Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage. The sex addiction industry really kind of blew up because there were lots and lots of highly moralistic, religious people within the sex addiction industry who opposed marriage equality. But there were also some gay men within the field who were sex addiction therapists who said, "Now wait a minute, why are you opposing this civil right?" That actually led to some interesting fracturing within the sex addiction industry. And a lot of those gay male therapists then left the sex addiction field because they now had the scales taken off their eyes, and they saw that the sex addiction industry was morally bankrupt, that it was based on homophobia, and based on religious notions of what healthy sexuality was.
Hmm. Hmm. So where did it come from? I mean, because people talk about being a chocoholic if they try, it comes from the word alcoholic, from the work of
Yeah,
Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12 steps of recovery. So how did they get sex addiction out of, cocaine addiction or alcohol addiction or heroin addiction?
well, so one, I mean, we're addicted to using the word addiction to describe any
So,
behavior that other people engage in more than we want them to. Um,
yeah.
the term addiction itself actually is just a really vague kind of concept now that doesn't have a whole lot of precise clinical meaning. The word moron used to be a medical term with a very precise meaning, but as society adopted it and started using it to call everybody an idiot or moron,
Mm,
then the medical field had to stop using the term because it didn't mean what it used to mean. The same is true for addiction.
mm,
We at the point at which people can talk about being addicted to chocolate, addicted to tanning beds, addicted to, I mean, my God, there was an article I read a couple of years ago where they were talking about people being addicted to day trading, to day stock
yeah.
trading,
Or
which is
video games
well,
now.
video games. At that point, the word addiction just has no meaning. Um,
Yeah.
that's one of the issues is that we just started using the term addiction and sex addiction in a very broad kind of way. At a more precise level, Pat Carnes, who's a psychologist, he was working in the prison system in the early 80s, and he was seeing men, sex offenders, who reported kind of high rates of sexual behavior problems and such like that. Pat Carnes had a history with alcohol problems, and I think was a member of AA. And he started applying the 12 steps of AA to sexuality, and he created the group Sex Addicts Anonymous. Using the 12 steps. However, the problem, and I'm conflicted about this because sex addict groups oftentimes offer social support to people in potentially healthy ways. However, we have to remember that 12-step groups are religious in nature. They are based on religious concepts, and they are they are applying religious-based thinking to sexual behaviors. And unfortunately, the by focusing on the sex, they distract from, for instance, the moral and religious conflict that may be going on there. For instance, if you're raised in a highly homophobic or religious culture, and now you grow up and you are thinking about same-sex desires, you're going to hate yourself and want those thoughts to go away. You might end up going to gay conversion therapy. And interestingly, most gay conversion therapists use a sex addiction model where they treat same-sex desires as though it's an addiction, and they even use a 12-step model to try to help people suppress those desires. There's
Wow.
also just a lot of, unfortunately, distraction. The sex addiction model is a two-dimensional model that is over-focused on sex, and it has the idea that the problem of sex addiction is that, it says two things. The sex is the problem, and the answer is to stop the sex. Well, with people who are struggling with sexuality, who's struggling with control of their sexuality, it's not actually the sex that's the problem. It is more often the religious issue, or, for instance, anxiety, and people who are using sexuality as a way to cope with their anxiety. If you don't treat the anxiety, and you just take away the sex, the person is not going to get better.
Yeah.
That unfortunately is kind of where this all started. And as I said, it came to fame during the 1980s when sexuality was condemned. We went through a very conservative social period around sexuality during the Reagan era.
Yeah.
And then we started having these celebrities, Tiger Woods and David Duchovny, getting in trouble for sexual behaviors and claiming that they were sex addicts and going to sex addiction summer camp to try and get out of responsibility for their behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing, though, is that has really changed. And if you noticed, when Harvey Weinstein got in trouble for sexual harassment and sexual assault of many beloved female actresses, he said, hey, I've got demons, people, and he went to sex addiction treatment.
Yeah.
But everybody said, yeah, bullshit, dude.
Right. That's right.
You don't get to use sex addiction as a get out of jail
That's not
card.
an addiction. That's privilege.
That's right.
Privilege is not a diagnosis.
Yeah, and not just privilege, but it's criminal. That's criminal behavior. And as you said, it's privilege. It is not by accident, interestingly, that research has now shown that, as I said, maybe I didn't say this, 90 to 95% of alleged sex addicts are men. Half of them are white men who are religious, are heterosexually married, and who make over $100,000 a year.
Yeah.
So we're talking about, in addition to something that is shaming sexual diversity, we're also talking about sexual privilege and people using this as a way to avoid responsibility for their choices to step outside their marriage agreements, or to engage in sexual behaviors that they were taught are wrong. We need to help those people, but telling them that they're addicted to sex, telling them that their sexual desires are disease, there's no evidence that it helps. And in fact, there's a good bit of evidence that it actually is unhealthy and may cause much more harm than it helps.
Yeah, because I think in addition to everything else, sex addiction treatment is expensive.
Yeah. I was talking to a physician over the weekend who had called me, and he had ended up in the sex addiction treatment world because he'd gotten caught engaging in infidelity. His couples therapist basically ordered him to go to sex addiction treatment. He paid $5,000 for a week of sex addiction treatment, and he said that there were people there at this sex addiction treatment facility who stayed there a month and were on their third month.
Wow.
He said
at $5,000 a week.
$5,000 a week. It is extraordinary, and insurance doesn't cover it because it's not a real diagnosis. It's not an accepted diagnosis, so your insurance company is not going to pay for it.
Yeah, that's something I think a lot of people don't know is that they say, I'm a sex addict, but yet they don't realize that you mentioned the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in the United States, anyways, is authored by the American Psychiatric Association. And I think a lot of people don't realize that everything they come to see a therapist about needs to be classified as a diagnosis under most circumstances. There's a word for it, but yet sex addiction's nowhere in this big, thick, 3 or 4 inch thick book.
It's important. So that we professionalize therapy. It is one of the ways that we make sure that we're not providing, for instance, an outdated, harmful treatment like recovered memory therapy, which did tremendous damage to people. And then lawsuits happened, and therapists had to stop using it. Sex addiction therapy, I'll say it again, there is no evidence that sex addiction therapy helps. There's
Wow.
only two.
Even
uh,
though it's $5,000 a week.
That's right. That's right. There's only two treatment models that have any demonstration of efficacy working with people with sexual behavior problems like this. One is cognitive behavioral therapy, and the other is acceptance and commitment therapy.
Yeah.
Both of these are treatments that, instead of focusing on the behavior, they start to change what we think about the behavior, what we think the behavior means, and we start to focus on, rather than stopping the behavior, we start to focus on um, increasing positive behaviors, changing the things that we do rather than trying to stop doing things that we don't like.
Yeah, that's what it's interesting you mentioned, because cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy are two of the ones that my colleagues and I use at Gay Therapy LA. Because if you have to not just take away sex addiction treatment, but you have to replace it with something with people in need, and so that's what we do. We go back to the anxiety or even to the relationship problems. Helping gay men sometimes have sexual complaints, and we try to address those, but maybe there's differences in desire between the two or more partners in the relationship. Maybe there's some kind of anxiety going on or pressure. Certainly during the pandemic, no pressure's there, right? So,
Right,
but
right.
what's been some of your recommendations if somebody comes to you and says, okay, so I'm not a sex addict because that's not a thing. Then what am I? What do I do if I'm cheating on my partner and I feel like I can't stop, or I'm hooking up a lot and I'm running late for work because I've been to a hookup and I'm late for my job. What do I do then? What do you say to those folks?
Well, one of the questions I started asking is, what is the function of this sexual behavior? What does it do in your life? So the two examples you just gave, one, a person engaging in, kind of serial infidelity with their partner. One of the questions I'll ask is, do you really want to be in this marriage? Is it possible that you're engaging in this infidelity because you want the relationship to end? You want things to blow up.
Mm-hmm.
I also then start asking about, is this relationship a good sexual match for you? As you mentioned, there are lots of people in relationships with mismatched libido where they would like to have sex more than their partner, or have different kind of sex than their partner is interested in having. And so they engage in sex outside their relationship to fulfill that need. That's a really important thing to identify and talk about. And then we talk about, is this relationship working for you? Um, and if because it sounds like you have all these needs outside the relationship that are not being met, and maybe we should talk about helping you to either negotiate an open relationship, or to end this relationship and find one that's a better match for you. For the man who is, hooking up and missing work and things like that, one of the questions I ask a lot of time is, are you engaging in these sexual behaviors because you are depressed or you're anxious, and being turned on is one of the only ways that you can change how you feel? That's one
Uh-huh.
of the things that we find, is that people engage in masturbation to pornography or hook up kind of impulsive sexuality, oftentimes because they are feeling very bad. They have negative emotions. And, one of the things is, when you're turned on, it turns off some of those parts of our brain that make us feel bad.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you don't have other coping strategies to help you manage your negative emotions, then you may overuse sex as a coping strategy. The answer to that is not to stop using sex, but to increase the use of other coping strategies, mindfulness, things like that. So, you know, many men engage in sexual behaviors kind of mindlessly. They are not paying attention to themselves. They're not being intentional in their sexuality. And so I invite people to turn off the autopilot and to start thinking about, the sexual behaviors that they're engaging in. So one guy that I worked with, he was a CEO of a very significant, financial company. He'd been in sex addiction treatment for I think 12 years.
Ooh, it's a long
Was
time.
yeah, was still engaging in infidelity with his wife, and his thing was going to massage parlors and getting massages and happy endings and such like that. So I never told the guy stop doing that, because sex addiction therapists had told him that for years, and he kept doing it. Instead, I focused on what was he getting out of this behavior? What did it do? And so we came up with this list of 5 things, including one of them being, it was a way for him to secretly get back at his wife when he was angry with his wife. And so we came up with this list of 5 things and that he got out of this behavior. And one day, he came in on a Monday and he said, he had found himself sitting in front of a massage parlor, and he was getting ready to go in because he'd been on autopilot, right? He wasn't paying attention to what he was doing. He was kind of engaging in thoughtless, kind of impulsive behavior. But before he went into the massage parlor, he sat down and he went through our checklist of, and he thought, how am I feeling about my wife? And have I talked to her about the things that I'm upset about? Have I dealt with this? Have I dealt with that? Am I feeling anxious? How am I feeling in my life? He went through this whole checklist, and at the end of it, he realized, oh gosh, there are some things here I need to think about and take care of. And he had run out of time to go into the massage parlor because he had to be somewhere. And but by doing that, it gave him now greater self-control, because it helped him to realize that this behavior was not coming out of nowhere, but it was coming out of inside of him in issues that he hadn't dealt with. His job was to deal with those issues. Now, if he went in and got a massage and a happy ending, I don't care. What I do care is when we engage in unhealthy behaviors without being thoughtful and having what I call sexual integrity, where we have now accepted our sexuality and we're making ethical, thoughtful kind of decisions about our sexual behavior.
Yeah. At my practice, and then also in the trainings that you give, we've talked about how Doug Brown Harvey and Michael Vigorito, in their book, Treating Out of Control Sexual Behavior, an alternative to the sex addiction model, talks about the 6 principles of sexual health, which has been, I said in a previous episode, how important that is, because even though that's a relatively new discussion, that book is not that old, those 6 principles that, give this idea of what is sexual health, not in a judgy way, like, sexual health is heterosexual sex in the confines of marriage between one man and one woman, but more humanitarian and more mindful, and certainly consensual. And
instead of changing what people do sexually, the sexual health model starts to invite us to change how they do it. Which again is the conversation I have with lots of sex addicts is, is there a way that these sexual behaviors could be healthy? And could we find, for instance, if you're engaging in, infidelity, do you need to go talk to your partner and see if we could negotiate an open relationship, which would be a way to engage in the same behavior in a healthy way? One of the examples I love to talk about is George Michael. In 1998, George Michael, at the age of 34, got caught having gay bathroom sex in Beverly Hills.
Yeah.
And he was ashamed and embarrassed. He was not out as being gay at the time, and he went to sex addiction treatment. He said, I'm a sex addict. But then about 10 or 12 years later, living in London, he was again caught having gay bathroom sex. But it's fascinating because this time his response to the journalist who were, the paparazzi who were trying to interview him,
Mm-hmm.
he said, are you gay? Because I am. And this is part of my culture. Fuck off.
Good for him.
So he no longer identified as a sex addict. What changed? His behavior didn't change, but the degree to which he now accepted himself and his sexual desires
Yeah. And
did.
taking the shame out of it, because
Absolutely.
people outside the gay community love to make a hobby out of shaming the gay community in one way or another, whether it's gay sex or whether it's kink or whether it's BDSM or whether it's polyamory or open relationships, whatever.
Completely.
It happens. Let's talk a little bit very similar, but a little different about porn, because that's, a lot of people all over the media, all over society have really strong opinions about, the use of porn, especially with the internet and Xtube and Pornhub and, the online porn now. It's not just buying a VHS video cassette anymore or even a DVD. And you wrote about maybe a healthy approach to porn, especially for men. What were some of the ideas behind your book on ethical porn for dicks?
Well, first, I think when we talk about pornography, we need to recognize we're actually talking about masturbation. And that 90 to 95% of male use of pornography is accompanied by masturbation, and it ends when the man has an orgasm. But we don't talk about that. We're talking about porn use, and we pretend that these guys are just watching porn and not jerking off. We really need to acknowledge the role of masturbation with this, and then we need to start talking about what is the masturbation for. We need to talk about for instance, men masturbate more in relationships when their partner doesn't want to have sex. The number one way to increase male masturbation and use of pornography is for the partner to stop wanting sex as much, because men use masturbation and pornography as a way to compensate for the degree of sexual frequency that they want but don't have access to. Mm-hmm. So when I see men who are reporting that they're using lots of porn, that's one of the first questions I start to explore. Are you having enough sex in your relationship? And if not, how can we help you to talk about that, negotiate that? I also, I see men who get in trouble looking at porn at work, and very often that is coming out of a place of a man who is depressed or anxious, and looking at porn as a way to change how he feels for a momentary basis. Again, with those guys, I say, look, it's fine to look at porn to change the way you feel, but you maybe don't want to do it at work. So what else can we do? What other coping strategies can we develop? But then also, I see a lot of men who are watching porn because they have secret sexual desires that they're ashamed of. And, I've seen multiple men get caught looking at porn at work. I ask them, what kind of porn are you watching? Because it really is important, I think, what kind of porn people are watching. It says something about their sexual desires. And many of these men tell me, well, I'm watching gay porn. Why are you watching gay porn at work? Because I'm not allowed to watch gay porn at home. My wife doesn't know I'm bisexual, and they haven't figured out how to negotiate or accommodate that in their life. Those are really important conversations.
Yeah.
Porn and porn-related problems are always just a symptom. They're never the cause. That I think is the really dangerous, problematic part of most of our conversations right now about pornography, is that we're pretending that porn is the cause of problems when actually it's a symptom of other issues.
Uh-huh. What about if you're a partner? So somebody is listening and they don't think of themselves as a sex addict, they don't think of themselves as a porn addict, but they feel like they're the partner of someone who is. They know their partner's cheating a lot when they have a monogamy agreement. They know that their partner seems to watch a lot of porn, maybe even at their expense. They're thinking that they're cheating, but with porn, and there's a lot of services about the betrayed partner of the sex addict. What are some of your thoughts about, the partners of the folks who supposedly have the problem?
Well, I mean, they need to watch out because, like you said, there's a whole snake oil industry out there that is gonna, take their money and tell them all these problems. Um, that is really exploitive, frankly, in my opinion. That betrayed partner treatment industry. Um, I think it is deceptively problematic to separate our partner's sexual behavior from them as a person. And I've seen many women who say, it was easier for me to think about my partner being a sex addict than to really wrestle with the idea that they were engaging in selfish, narcissistic behavior that did not take my needs into consideration. And when I finally had that conversation with myself was when I realized that it wasn't the sex that was the problem, it was my partner.
Wow.
That's a very challenging conversation. Again, it's a distraction to talk about the sex as opposed to talking about the person.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the person.
So somebody who's violating their monogamy agreement a lot, is it safe to say they've got narcissistic because narcissistic personality disorder is in the big DSM book, and it's a problem. So what do you say to people who?
I definitely see, very significant kind of levels of narcissism. I see people who oftentimes have a tremendous amount of shame. They want to engage, for instance, in BDSM, spanking kind of behaviors or something like that, but they don't feel like they can do that with their wife. And so they engage in that secretly. One guy I saw who he got in trouble looking at porn at work and lost his job. And I asked him, what kind of porn are you watching? And he was watching water sports porn, urination porn. And I said, does your wife know you're into this? He goes, no. Well, he'd been married 12 years. And I said, maybe it's time to talk to your wife about this. And we role played how he could go home and talk to his wife about this sexual interest. He came back and he said, dude, she's into it.
Wow.
They had never had the conversation. And she was now willing to pee. And he would watch her, and then they would have hot sex.
Wow.
He no longer had to engage in that behavior in secret.
Just by talking to her about his...
By talking about it, we
So that's
managed...
a lesson for folks. If they have a fantasy, talk about it with your partner. That's cool.
Yeah.
So, well, we've talked about your books. Switching gears a little bit, you've accomplished so much. All these great books, all the great teachings, and you have a disability. People can't see, but you have a disability. Tell us about what your disability is and how you've lived with a disability.
So, I was born with only one hand. I have what's called terminal limb deficiency. My left arm is short and doesn't have a fully developed hand, and my parents are really amazing people. The doctors kept me in the hospital for like an extra week or two, worried about me when I was born. My parents went home and they started practicing doing everything they could with just one hand, tying their shoes with just one hand, and trying to figure out what it was going to be like for me. And they really taught me from a very early age that just because I was different doesn't mean there was anything wrong with me, and that my job was to figure out how to do things my way. So
that sounds like what a lot of gay men go through.
Yeah, it created this kind of cognitive model in me where there's not one right way to do things, and so I became a person who always looked at are there other ways to accomplish this? Is this the only right way to do something, both physically and mentally? And honestly, that's one reason why I looked at the sex addiction model and I said, is this right? I know it's very accepted, but is this right? And then I argued, obviously, as I researched it, that it wasn't. But that has led me to be very successful, because I'm willing to look at different ways to do things. And it has given me a very significant kind of level of cognitive flexibility. I think I'd be a different person if I had two hands. I think I would probably not be as creative, or cognitively flexible as I am. And so in a lot of ways, my disability has taught me some very, very valuable lessons that I wouldn't give up. It also,
It's amazing to write three books and articles, and that's a lot of typing with only one hand. So
yeah,
that's a lot of productivity. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, my hand hurts sometimes. Let me tell you that.
wow, is it fast? I mean, I guess you've learned to type really fast with when you're
Yeah,
home.
well, it's funny because, yeah, gosh, I don't think I've ever talked about this. When I was in middle school, I took a typing class, and the teacher didn't know what to do with me, but she found a book called One Hand Typing, and she basically let me just sit in the corner and practice. And I have my
Wow.
own way of typing, but I can get up to 30, 35 words a minute, and pretty productive. And I, again, I've learned how to make it work, and I've learned how to
Uh,
make it work my way.
of course, nowadays we have voice to text, so that might be.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that because
Uh,
I'm a person that, I think by writing often, and by
ah,
putting words on a page, typing them out. It's both how I learn. If I want to learn something, I write it out and then I retype it. It gets it into my brain. The voice to text just doesn't seem to do the same thing for me.
wow. And I know you're a jujitsu enthusiast too. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been a wrestler kind of my whole life, and
Wow.
I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I have a black belt in that, and been training that for about 15 years. And I'm really lucky. I get to work out with these UFC fighters, MMA fighters, some of the top ones in the world, who are they're young, they're athletic, and they see me, this kind of old dude with one hand, and then I tap them out and I submit them and I show them that actually, my arm is something that gives me an advantage in many cases, because there are things that they can't do to me, and there are things I can do to them that they can't stop.
Wow.
It again, it's really interesting, and it's one of those places that has taught me a lot about the person I am with my disability, and how it impacts, me, not in unhealthy ways.
Yeah, that's so inspiring. We talk a lot about adaptive versus maladaptive coping. In a previous episode, I talked about adaptive coping for the COVID pandemic. And, there's so much about with life's challenges. We say, how can I take a positive approach to this? Or how can I take an adaptive coping approach to this? So
Exactly.
I know we have listeners in, lots of countries of the world, certainly in the United States and in California where I am, but, we also have in the UK and Australia and South Africa and New Zealand. And so how are some of these issues like sex addiction and porn, how does that play out in other countries of the world? Do you know, besides the United States?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. So, sex addiction is largely a United States phenomenon. There are not really treatment centers or, sex addiction treatment programs in most other parts of the world. They're starting to be in some cases, as American kind of conflict about sexuality, American Puritanism around sexuality infiltrates, some other communities. And what I want to say to you is, don't let it in. Um, instead of letting this kind of puritanical be obsessed with sex and ashamed of sex at the same time, instead of letting that instead think now about how you can train therapists to recognize and acknowledge sexual diversity and treat sexual problems as symptoms of other issues rather than getting hung up on the sex. Let the sexual hangups stay America's problem.
Say America's Puritanism. Yeah. So,
Yes.
good. Yeah, because a lot of time, I mean, not always, but the experience of gay men is different in other countries, well, sometimes worse in certain countries where it's illegal and all that, and sometimes better where equal rights are, long established. So, wow. Well, Dr. Ley, thank you so much for doing all of this. This has been really great. Once again, the books are The Myth of Sex Addiction, Ethical Porn for Dicks. We didn't talk about cuckolding. Maybe that's another kind of topic and it's got a lot of straight examples. But and that's by David Ley, Ley.
Right.
So available wherever you find your books online. So, and for listeners, always, if you have an interest in sex therapy, regular therapy, or coaching, I do coaching all over the United States and guys in other countries. We just watch the time zone. Call me or text me in the United States at area code 310-339-5778. That's 310-339-5778. And you can find blog articles about sex therapy and relationships and money management and coping with the pandemic and all kinds of stuff at gaytherapyla.com. And if you like this, please let the world know, share it with your friends, give a review, give a like, share it, whatever you can do. And thanks for listening. And thank you to Dr. Ley for being with us today. And I'll see you next time.